Pull up a chair and lock the door behind you, because what just detonated inside the corporate spine of the music business is not a beef. It is not a subliminal caption thrown from a Miami balcony. It is not a diss record. What just happened is a full-blown corporate execution, tailored in a bespoke suit, signed across a mahogany table, and stamped in red ink over the entire ledger of modern hip-hop. By the time this breakdown is finished, you will understand why every executive from Manhattan to Miami, from Atlanta to Los Angeles, from London to Toronto is quietly closing their office door tonight and canceling their weekend plans. Because Curtis Jackson, 50 Cent, did not simply fire another shot at Rick Ross. Curtis Jackson built a machine engineered to consume a career whole. And Rick Ross, wearing his own bespoke suit on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon with the whole culture watching in ultra-high definition, walked directly into the mouth of it. Now hold on, because I already hear the objection forming in your mouth. You are about to tell me this is the same tired feud, He walks into production meetings where the phrase unit economics gets used more often than the phrase Hot 16. And the man he just corporately dismantled is not the same Rick Ross who dropped Trilla or Deeper Than Rap either. That Rick Ross had label backing, radio, a chart, a Def Jam war chest, and a culture willing to bend around him. The Rick Ross bleeding on the boardroom floor right now is a legacy artist sitting on a first-week album under a man who once moved 180,000 units out of the gate is now moving fewer physical units than a suburban SoundCloud artist with a viral 15-second clip. And that number leaking into the internet was not the disaster. That number leaking into one very specific executive inbox, the inbox at G-Unit Film and Television, that was the disaster. Because Curtis Jackson has been sitting on a specific file for 17 years, waiting for exactly the set of coordinates the universe just handed him on a silver tray. You feel me? Because this is where the general public keeps getting it wrong. Most people think 50 Cent is petty. He is not petty. He is patient. And that distinction is the one Rick Ross missed for a decade and a half. Curtis Jackson has been quietly stacking leverage in the dark. Rick Ross has been publicly stacking jet skis on Instagram. And when the venue reports started rolling in, arenas booked at 19, 20, 22% capacity, front row sections being papered with buy one get one half off promo codes routed through third-party discount aggregators. Curtis Jackson did not laugh out loud. Curtis Jackson closed his laptop, walked into a legal meeting on the top floor of his production offices, and issued a single instruction. Not a diss track. Not a meme. An instruction. And in that instruction, the entire music industry landscape started rerouting around Rick Ross the way a river routes around a stone. Because Curtis Jackson does not need to beat Rick Ross on a song anymore. Curtis Jackson has been in the business of buying floors. The floor you stand on, the floor you walk on, the floor you sign contracts on. And when you own the floor, the man standing on it is already inventory. He is already an asset line item sitting on somebody else's balance sheet. He simply has not been informed yet. Here is where the ground turned. On Tuesday morning, before most executives had finished their first espresso, a series of confidential legal notices went out from Curtis Jackson's corporate counsel to the boards of 3 major distribution networks, 2 international venue conglomerates, and 1 dominant streaming platform. The letters were not threats. The letters were reminders. Reminders that G-Unit Film and Television's multi-year, multi-title production pipeline, a pipeline currently underwriting a significant portion of the premium cable and streaming ecosystem, could be reevaluated in the event these same partners continued to distribute, promote, host, or otherwise amplify Rick Ross' catalog and touring calendar. Read that sentence again slowly, because the phrasing is doing more surgical work than any diss track ever could. Curtis Jackson did not ask them to drop Rick Ross. Curtis Jackson asked them to choose. And when you are a boardroom sitting on a 9-figure content pipeline, with Curtis Jackson standing on one side of the scale and a 2001 week album standing on the other, that is not a math problem. That is a formality. There is not one executive in that building willing to bleed for Rick Ross tour dates at the cost of their own production slate. Not one. Not on a Tuesday. Not on any day. Now, let me pull back the curtain on what happened next, because the speed of the collapse is the story here. By 10 in the morning that same day, an internal memo leaked out of a major international venue booking agency. 3 arena dates on Rick Ross' European and domestic tour route were placed on administrative hold pending, and I am quoting the memo verbatim, a full operational and financial risk assessment. Venue underwriters cited insufficient advanced ticket velocity and elevated operational liability, which is the polite corporate way of saying we are not eating a loss on a man Curtis Jackson has just informally blacklisted. The dominoes did not stagger. The dominoes fell simultaneously. Streaming playlists began quietly disappearing Rick Ross' new album by lunchtime. Programming executives stopped returning calls. Radio spins locked in for the weekend went suddenly unlocked. Sync deals in active negotiation went stone cold. And by 2 in the afternoon Eastern, William Leonard Roberts too had transitioned from headliner to industry contagion. From a name on a marquee to a risk flag on a spreadsheet. From a brand to a cautionary line item highlighted in yellow on next Monday's risk review deck. That is not spin. That is the timeline. That is what 6 hours of Curtis Jackson's accumulated corporate leverage looked like when it finally hit the open marketplace. Curtis Jackson then took his victory lap on camera. He does that. He always does that. And this time the lap was cinematic. A single photograph. Curtis Jackson seated at the head of a long mahogany conference table. 6 executives in tailored suits arrayed on either side of him. A leather portfolio open in front of him. One fountain pen resting on the top page like a punctuation mark. Caption underneath, 7 words, I told y'all I was cleaning house. Then the follow-up post, 30 seconds later, nobody is booking the fake boss. Labels don't want him. Venues don't want him. The bots got flagged. Packett and Ricky, the ride is over. I want you to feel the surgical precision of that word choice for a second. Not the ride is done. Not the ride is finished. The ride is over. Present tense. Declared final. Curtis Jackson was not predicting Rick Ross' collapse. Curtis Jackson was narrating it in real time. And the culture, the same culture that watched Rick Ross wear the biggest boss title for 15 years, did not defend him. It piled on. It piled on hard. Because the optics were catastrophic. For a decade and a half, Rick Ross told us he ran boardrooms. In one afternoon, Curtis Jackson demonstrated who was actually walking into them, sitting down at the head of the table and pulling the door closed behind him. That is not a diss. That is a demotion. And emotions do not get undone by a diss track. Let me take you inside the Promised Land estate in Georgia, because what happened inside those gates over the next several hours is the human core of this whole story. Sources close to Maybach Music Group describe a scene bordering on organizational panic. The road manager was on one line. The distribution rep was on another line. Event promoters in 5 different states were on hold across 3 separate phones. The catering vendor for the European leg was asking whether to process refunds. The insurance carrier on the tour bond was demanding updated capacity projections in writing before the end of business Eastern. And in the middle of all of it, Rick Ross himself, silk robe, cigar, cell phone in one hand, laptop balanced on the other, trying to hold the mythology together while the mythology was actively being repossessed behind his back. Ross did what Ross has always done. He went live. He hit Instagram, chin up, jaw set, camera framed exactly right, and delivered a rant that in any other decade would have gone iconic. He accused Curtis Jackson of running to white executives to shut down black art. He accused Curtis Jackson of using dirty Hollywood tactics because Curtis Jackson could not touch him on wax. He called Curtis Jackson an informant in a suit. A line that in a different decade would have detonated across the culture. But this decade did not care. This decade watched a man in a silk robe defend an empire that was already being liquidated in the next room. And that is a hard visual to walk back from. You cannot argue your way out of a repossession by rapping louder into a ring light. Now follow me carefully here, because this is the part most creators are going to miss. The blacklisting was not the story. The blacklisting was the smoke. The fire was underneath the whole time. And Curtis Jackson lit it 7 years ago. At 2:30 in the afternoon Eastern, an entertainment reporter published a bombshell that stopped the entire industry mid-step. Leaked communications between a high-ranking executive at a major distribution conglomerate and Curtis Jackson's legal team revealed the actual mechanism of the check was not routing back to the promised land estate. The check was crossing town to G-Unit's finance office. And Curtis Jackson knew it before he sent the first letter. That is the exact reason he sent the first letter. He was not trying to bury the album. He was trying to inflate the garnishment. He wanted every dollar to arrive stamped with his name on it. Every step backward is a default. This is the geometry of a corporate execution. And Curtis Jackson drew the map with his own hand. You want to know how a Maybach music strategist described the situation privately? He said it out loud on the phone with a business affairs lawyer at 3 in the afternoon, and it leaked to the press inside the hour. He said, and I am quoting directly from the notes I have been shown, "We are not fighting a beef anymore. We are fighting a hostile takeover. And we brought a diss track to a debt collection." That line is going to end up in a Wharton Business School case study one day. And somewhere in the back of that classroom, a 22-year-old with a rap dream and a demo tape is going to hear it read aloud and finally understand why the paperwork matters more than the punchlines. Because that is the sentence that captures the entire imbalance of the war. Rick Ross prepared for a rap battle. Curtis Jackson prepared for a corporate war. And the instant the two strategies met inside the open marketplace, one of them stopped being a strategy and became a target. Rick Ross did not lose this fight in 2026. Rick Ross lost this fight in 2011 in a conference room he never attended, on a document he never bothered to reread. Here is where it gets darker, because Rick Ross' team did what any cornered organization does when the walls close in. They filed. Late in the afternoon, Ross' legal team announced an emergency federal lawsuit alleging tortious interference, predatory corporate harassment, and illegal restraint of trade. They asked a federal judge for an immediate injunction against Curtis Jackson's debt enforcement mechanism. On paper, this is a reasonable move. On paper, this is what any competent legal team would do at this exact moment. But paper does not know Curtis Jackson. Paper cannot warn you. Paper cannot flinch. Paper only knows what it was drafted to know. And Curtis Jackson's paper was drafted by attorneys who have been quietly rehearsing for this exact filing for years. Because Curtis Jackson's legal counsel responded with one sentence. One single sentence. And that one sentence froze the entire Maybach music war room mid-breath. Quote, "We welcome the litigation, as discovery will require Rick Ross to submit 10 years of unedited tax returns and offshore financial records under penalty of perjury." End quote. Let that sentence sit in your chest for a moment. Because that sentence is not a legal response. That sentence is a nuclear deterrent. Curtis Jackson is not saying we will beat you in court. Curtis Jackson is saying we will open your books in court, and everything you have spent 20 years hiding will become a matter of public record filed under your name. For a man whose entire brand is built on the perceived scale of his wealth, discovery is not a legal risk. Discovery is an existential risk. If the tax returns say what the industry has whispered for a decade, that the promised land estate is leveraged to the ceiling, that the Wingstop franchises sit on a co-signed line of credit, that the private jet is a lease and not a title, that the offshore accounts are not remotely what the raps have always advertised, then Rick Ross does not lose a lawsuit. Rick Ross loses the mythology. And in hip-hop, the mythology is the collateral. The mythology is the entire asset. There is no comeback from a discovered bank statement. Because the moment those documents hit the docket, they hit the internet, and every A&R, every promoter, every festival buyer starts pricing Rick Ross the way you price a used luxury car with a title problem. Slowly downward. And with pity in their voice. All right, family, take a breath, because we're about to talk about the piece that turns this from a hostile financial siege into a full historic corporate takeover. This is the piece that is going to keep music lawyers wide awake for the next 6 months. At 5:45 Eastern this afternoon, a corporate registry filing surfaced out of the state of Florida. A newly formed investment group, organized under a Delaware LLC, registered agent in Tallahassee, filing counsel located out of a Brick Hill Avenue office in Miami, submitted a formal buyout offer for the full Maybach Music Group trademark, portfolio, and catalog rights. The filing states that the investment group has already acquired a controlling interest in Maybach Music's underlying debt obligations from a mix of institutional lenders and secondary market debt buyers. And if Rick Ross defaults on his upcoming liability payments, which given the tour freeze and the streaming audit is not a hypothetical, that is a Tuesday, the investment group is positioned to convert the debt directly into equity. Ownership. Brand. Catalog. Masters. The whole thing. The whole ecosystem. The whole 17-year story priced at whatever number sits on a foreclosure docket. And I want you to sit with that valuation for a second. Because the number on a foreclosure docket is never the number the artist thinks the empire is worth. The person selling is never in the room. The person buying is never emotional. And the price is always, always, always lower than the mythology said it should be. Read the next details slowly, because this is where the room goes silent. The principal managing director listed on the corporate filing is a high-ranking corporate attorney whose day job is chief legal counsel at G-Unit Film and Television. Which means the vehicle acquiring Maybach Music is not a passive investor floating in from outside the industry. The vehicle acquiring Maybach Music is a strategic acquisition arm directly aligned with Curtis Jackson's personal corporate structure. Curtis Jackson is not just blacklisting Rick Ross from the music industry. Curtis Jackson is legally attempting to purchase the empire that made Rick Ross into Rick Ross in the first place. If the buyout goes through, and given the debt position, the timing, and the venue collapse, the word if is doing a lot of light lifting in that sentence. Curtis Jackson will own the Maybach Music Group name, the back catalog, the master recordings, and by legal extension the branding infrastructure of everything Rick Ross has released since 2009. He will own the logo. He will own the trademark. He will own the tour name. He will own the color scheme, the font, the visual signature, and the 17 years of accumulated brand equity Ross spent his entire adult life building. I want you to sit with the moral weight of that for a moment. Rick Ross' name is not just an artist name. The Rick Ross brand is an ecosystem. Meek Mill signed to that ecosystem. Will signed to that ecosystem. Stally, O'Malley, Rocky Fresh, Gunplay. At one point, an entire generation of artists routed their careers through the Maybach Music brand. And if Curtis Jackson owns the trademark, Curtis Jackson owns the branding rights on every project stamped with that logo, retroactively. This is where the industry began whispering the word no executive ever wants to say out loud. Precedent. Because if this works, and it is very clearly working, then the model of the corporate hostile takeover of a hip-hop label just got proven in daylight. It just got a case study. And every legacy artist with a leveraged catalog just felt a cold breeze on the back of their neck at the same moment. Now hold on. I want to give the counterargument its full airtime, because you deserve both sides of this debate presented at full strength. There is a legitimate camp, a serious camp, not a trolling camp, arguing that Curtis Jackson has just weaponized private capital in a way that threatens every independent black-owned label in the game. If a media mogul can quietly purchase the distressed debt of a rival, engineer a public revenue collapse, and then convert the debt into equity at the moment of default, then no independent label is truly independent. That is not paranoia. That is Wall Street. That is what leveraged buyouts have been for 40 years across every industry from steel to airlines to retail. What is new is watching it unfold inside hip-hop in real time with the executioner narrating the play-by-play from a private jet with a champagne flute in his hand. Whether you cheer it or condemn it, you have to acknowledge the shift. This is not the same industry it was on Monday morning. Something structural moved. And structural moves do not move back. This is the difference between a bad news cycle and a paradigm change. A bad news cycle heals. A paradigm change rewrites the textbook. And the textbook just got rewritten. The other camp, Team Curtis Jackson, and it is a large camp, argues something entirely different. They argue this was earned. They argue Rick Ross had 17 years to sharpen his corporate game the way Curtis Jackson sharpened his, and instead chose to sharpen his catering budget. They argue that boasting about ownership on wax for a decade and a half without ever holding structural equity is exactly the kind of costume that eventually gets ripped off inside a boardroom nobody televised. They argue Curtis Jackson did not cheat. Curtis Jackson simply read the game. And the difference between reading the game and getting read by the game is the difference between owning your masters and finding out your masters were collateralized in 2011 by a partner you had already forgotten you signed with. Both camps are correct on their own terms. Both camps miss the deeper story. Because the deeper story is not Curtis Jackson versus Rick Ross. The deeper story is that hip-hop just crossed a threshold, and there is no crossing back. For 30 years, the culture told itself that beefs were about bars, that respect was about catalog, that legacy was about influence and radio spins and freestyles at Hot 97. In one single afternoon, Curtis Jackson demonstrated that the currency has changed underneath our feet. The currency is not bars anymore. The currency is corporate leverage. If you have not been building it, you do not have it. And if you do not have it, then a man who has been building it in silence for a decade can arrive at your door with a portfolio, a smile, a notary stamp, and a black-suited attorney, and you will not have a single move. You will not have a friend in the room to make a call for you, because the person who owns the room is the person who bought the room. And Curtis Jackson has been quietly buying rooms since the vitamin water deal closed in 2007. Let me pull you back inside the Promised Land estate for one more scene, because I have sources placing the mood at the compound as of the last 2 hours. Rick Ross has gone quiet. The Instagram lives have stopped. The Silk Robe monologues have paused. The team is in a closed-door meeting with 2 law firms, one civil, one criminal adjacent, reviewing whether there is any procedural doorway that can be shut on Curtis Jackson's investment vehicle before the trademark filing enters its next hearing window. There is talk of a preliminary injunction. There is talk of an emergency federal filing. There is talk of a settlement. A settlement from a man who has told us for 15 years, over and over, that he does not settle. Meek Mill has been on the phone with the team all afternoon. Will has not made a public comment. Stally posted a Bible verse and deleted it 40 minutes later. Floyd Mayweather posted a laughing emoji from a yacht in the Mediterranean, which honestly at this point should be considered a form of legal notice in itself. And Curtis Jackson, according to a source inside G-Unit, is sleeping like a man who has been waiting 17 years to sleep like this. Do you feel the weight of that sentence? 17 years. Curtis Jackson did not spend 17 years planning revenge. Curtis Jackson spent 17 years building the infrastructure so that when the moment finally arrived, revenge would not require effort. It would require a signature. That is the truly terrifying part of this whole story. Curtis Jackson did not have to work today. Curtis Jackson had to sign today. The work was done between 2008 and now, quietly, off camera, off the podcast circuit, off the diss track carousel. The reason nobody saw it coming is because Curtis Jackson does not narrate his construction phase. Curtis Jackson only narrates the demolition phase. And by the time the narration begins, the building is already down and the debris is already being sorted for resale. That is not luck. That is a doctrine. Doctrines, unlike beefs, scale. Doctrines get applied to the next target, and the target after that, and the target after that one, until the doctrine writes itself into the operating system of the industry. This is where the ground cracks for the second time. Because a second set of documents surfaced in the last 90 minutes, and I am watching this in real time as I record, indicating that Curtis Jackson's investment group has also been in preliminary contact with a major streaming platform regarding a licensing renegotiation covering the entire Maybach Music back catalog. The renegotiation, if executed, would restructure the royalty flow on every historic Rick Ross album released under the label. From Trilla to Rich Forever to Mastermind to Port of Miami and every project in between, under new ownership terms. In plain English, Curtis Jackson is not just trying to purchase the label. Curtis Jackson is trying to retitle the historical catalog itself. Every song, every guest verse, every hook Whale sang, every bar Meek Mill rapped under that logo, every ad-lib Ross buried in a mixdown at a Fort Lauderdale studio 12 years ago. If the renegotiation closes, the entire commercial history of Maybach Music Group would be listed under a Curtis Jackson-controlled entity. And that is not a takeover. That is a rewriting of the historical record. That is Curtis Jackson editing the closing credits on a 20-year run and stamping his name on the final frame. Drop your verdict in the thread below, because the culture is genuinely split on this one, and I want to know where you land. Is Curtis Jackson the most strategically ruthless executive hip-hop has ever produced? Is Rick Ross a cautionary tale about talking ownership without ever building ownership? Is this the moment private capital finally cracked open the last independent corner of the music business? Or is this, and this is the argument I want you to steal from me in the comments, is this the payback Curtis Jackson has been owed since 2008, delivered with the icy precision of a man who understands that the loudest revenge is the one that arrives in a manila envelope with a court date on the second page? I want your take. I want the raw take, not the polite one. The raw one. The one you would tell your best friend at midnight on the phone. That is the take I want in the thread. Now let me answer the question I know you're typing right now, because I am watching the comment section move in real time. You're asking, can Rick Ross survive this? I have to be honest with you, because you deserve honesty and not spin. The financial answer is complicated. The optical answer is not. Financially, Rick Ross has assets. He has real estate. He has the Wingstop franchise portfolio. He has income streams outside the Maybach music trademark itself. He is not a poor man. He will not be a poor man tomorrow. But optically, and hip-hop lives and dies on optics, Rick Ross has already lost the war he cares about most. Because the biggest boss brand cannot be repaired once the internet has watched the debt collector walk into the office through the front door. You cannot unsee a man's ledger. And once the ledger is seen, the boss becomes a debtor, and the debtor becomes a story. Once you are a story, you are no longer the storyteller. That transition is the actual injury. Every other loss can be re-earned. The loss of the microphone, the loss of being the one who narrates the culture, that loss compounds daily. Nobody has ever bought it back. Not once. Not ever. That is the trapdoor Rick Ross fell through this week, and nobody in his camp is carrying a ladder long enough to reach the bottom. Let me widen the lens one more time, because I owe you the historical parallel here. There is exactly one other moment in hip-hop history that comes close to what we are watching tonight. In the mid-2000s, when Master P watched his no-limit empire get eaten alive by distribution disputes and IRS tax liens, the culture wrote it off as a personal failure. It was not a personal failure. It was a structural failure. Master P built a brand faster than he built the corporate frame required to hold it up. And when the frame gave out, the brand went down with it. Curtis Jackson watched that whole thing unfold in real time. As a young artist coming up, Curtis Jackson took notes. Curtis Jackson learned the exact lesson the industry hoped nobody would learn. That the death of a rap empire is almost never the music. It is almost always the paperwork. Curtis Jackson has been reverse engineering that lesson into a weapon for 2 decades now. What you are watching this week is not a beef reaching its climax. What you are watching this week is Curtis Jackson delivering the finished, bound, footnoted version of a thesis he started writing in 2003. There is one more piece I have to give you before we close, and this piece is the piece that changes what you thought this entire video was about. Because up to this moment, the story has been Curtis Jackson versus Rick Ross. That is not the whole story. The whole story is that Curtis Jackson has just written the playbook for the next decade of hip-hop corporate warfare, and every executive at every major label is downloading that playbook onto their laptop tonight. Sources at 2 competing labels confirmed on background that internal memos went out this evening instructing legal teams to, and I am quoting the language of the memo, audit exposure to legacy artist catalogs currently held under co-signed distribution agreements. Read that sentence twice, because what that memo says in plain English is check who owes what to whom, and check whether Curtis Jackson's model could be executed against our artists too. Curtis Jackson did not just take down Rick Ross. Curtis Jackson taught the industry that the takedown was structurally possible. There are at least 8 legacy artists. I will not name them tonight, but I will name them in the next breakdown, whose catalog structure looks eerily similar to what Rick Ross looked like on Monday morning. 8. 8 men who used to sleep well. 8 men who are not sleeping tonight. 8 men whose lawyers are drafting the exact emergency memo Rick Ross lawyers were drafting 6 hours ago. Here is the part that should chill you the whole way through. Because I've been on the phone for the last 3 hours with people I trust, and every single one of them told me the same thing in slightly different words. This was never about Rick Ross. Rick Ross was the demonstration. Rick Ross was the pilot episode. Rick Ross was Curtis Jackson proving the concept to a room full of investors who now hold a case study, a template, and a proof of concept in their hands. Once you have a template, you do not stop at one target. You stop when you run out of targets. Which means the next 12 months in this industry are not going to look anything like the last 12 months looked. The next 12 months are going to look like a season of a corporate crime drama Curtis Jackson himself would executive produce. Because in a very literal way, he already is. Alright, family, we are landing this plane, but I need you to stay with me for 30 more seconds, because what happens over the next 72 hours is going to be everything. If a federal judge signs the injunction Rick Ross team filed this afternoon, the entire debt garnishment mechanism gets paused and Curtis Jackson has to slow down. If the judge denies the injunction, the trademark buyout window opens and the Maybach Music Group name changes hands before the end of the fiscal quarter. That is the fork in the road. 2 outcomes, 1 binary decision, by 1 federal judge in 1 Florida courtroom. Whichever way it lands, the shockwave hits every catalog owner in this business. Do not let anybody tell you otherwise. Do not let a single podcast host frame this as a personal beef, because that framing is a lie of omission. This is a leveraged buyout dressed up in beef clothing. That is the whole trick. That has always been the whole trick. Hit that subscribe button, because this story is not slowing down for anybody. Turn on the notifications, because we have sources placing the injunction hearing sometime in the next 48 to 72 hours, and I will not sleep until I have the ruling for you the second it drops. I am watching this in real time. I have people inside 3 of the parent companies. I have people inside 2 of the legal firms. I have a friend who works catering at the venue where the emergency Maybach meeting was held tonight, and I know exactly what time the last black car left the parking lot. The second the courtroom moves, we are moving with it. Part 2 of this breakdown is already in production. Part 2 is where I name the 8 other legacy artists whose catalogs may be next on the block. Part 2 is where I break down the offshore corporate structure that Curtis Jackson's investment vehicle is actually built on, layer by layer, entity by entity, jurisdiction by jurisdiction. Part 2 is where I show you the 7-page contract clause from 2011 that made every single dollar of this possible. Because once you see the diagram, you are going to understand this was never a beef, and it was never going to be anything except this. Drop your verdict in the thread. Did Curtis Jackson finally deliver the 17-year receipt? Or did he just weaponize private capital against black-owned music in a way we are all going to regret one day? Did Rick Ross deserve this? Or did the culture just watch a public execution dressed up as a rap feud? Did the industry get exposed? Or did the industry get taught? I am reading the comments tonight. I am replying to the best takes personally. Tell me who wins. Tell me who loses. Tell me what happens to a culture that just watched a man buy his rival's empire and stamp his own name on the front door. Because whatever you think the answer is right now, I promise you the truth is going to be uglier, sharper, and more historically consequential than anything you have seen in this business in 20 years. I will be the one telling you when it lands. Stay locked in. Stay sharp. Stay skeptical. And whatever you do, do not blink. Because in this industry, the blink is where the empire changes hands.